They called him Pastor Samuel, the boy with nothing but an old Bible and a heart full of fire. In the small town of Nekenka, he preached to empty chairs while children laughed and neighbors mocked. But what began with whispered prayers and a mother's quiet faith soon became miracles, fame, and power beyond imagination. People said he made the blind see, the crippled walk, the barren rejoice. But beneath the altar of his fast-growing church, a terrible secret slept, one built not on grace, but on sacrifice. This isn't just the story of how a man rose from dust to glory. It's the story of what he buried to get there, and what truth unearthed when it finally came knocking. If you're drawn to stories of faith, power, betrayal, and redemption, then stay with us. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment below, because you won't believe how this one ends. Idealing. In the quiet town of Nkenka, where dust painted everything in shades of tired brown and time seemed to move slower than the sun, there lived a thin boy named Samuel. He wasn't like the other boys his age. While they chased lizards across dry fields or played ball with torn rubber, Samuel walked around with an old Bible tucked under his arm, the leather peeling and its pages crumbling like dried leaves. His voice was soft, but his dreams were loud. At 17, he stood tall on shaky wooden floors and called himself a man of God. His church, if it could be called that, was little more than a skeleton of tired planks nailed together with more hope than strength. The roof was made of patched zinc sheets, dented and riddled with holes, so when the rain fell, it fell straight through, soaking the floor and every plastic chair inside. And yet, every Sunday, without fail, Samuel arranged those 10 white chairs like he was preparing for kings. But no one came. Only the wind answered his call. Still, he preached with passion. He shouted prayers into empty space, raising his hands like a man holding lightning. Passers-by would glance in, amused or pitying. Some shook their heads and muttered that the boy was mad. "He's wasting his life," one man said, laughing with a cigarette between his fingers. Another joked, "Even his own shadow won't say amen." Children nicknamed him Pastor of Empty Benches and chased each other around the church, mocking him as if it were a game. But Samuel never stopped, because one person believed in him. Just one. His mother, Mama Ruth, one. Mama Ruth wasn't the soft, smiling type. Her face was carved by hard years, tight lines from sun and labor, lips that rarely curved into laughter, but her heart was tender in ways most people never saw. She sold yam by the roadside, under the sweltering sun and unkind gazes, wrapping slices in old newspapers with hands worn from work. Every coin she earned, she split, half for their survival, half for Samuel's ministry. She never missed morning prayer, not even once. And every night, when Samuel returned home, discouraged and dusty, she would kneel beside him, wash his tired feet with warm water, and whisper, "Don't stop, my son. Your star is just hiding now, but one day, it will shine." It was those words that kept him going, not applause, not miracles, just his mother's faith. And as the world passed by his little church like a forgotten corner, Samuel stood firm, waiting for something to change, not knowing that what would come next would change more than just his life. It would shake the very ground he stood on. That night was heavy, the kind of night where even the wind feels cautious and the sky holds its breath. Samuel sat outside the church, the same way he did every Sunday after another sermon to no one. His eyes were low, fixed on the dusty ground beneath his feet. His hands were dry and calloused, cracked from work, and his hope hung limp like soaked cloth on a line. When Mama Ruth stepped out of their small kitchen, her wrapper stained with oil and the scent of roasted yam following her, she found him there, still, silent. She sat beside him on the low bench and looked at the sky, where clouds moved without shape. "Samuel," she said, her voice calm but deep, "this world does not reward clean hands. It rewards those who know how to enter deep waters." He looked at her, confused, unsure of what she meant. But she only placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "If you follow me tonight, your life will never be the same." One, they didn't carry anything. No bag, no Bible. Just their feet and something deeper. Faith, perhaps, or desperation. They left the house as the moon hid behind clouds and the trees leaned in like they were listening. The forest wasn't far, But that night, it felt endless. Branches reached across the path like arms. Owls cried in the distance. Leaves rustled with secrets. They kept walking, past streams that whispered and rocks that looked like faces in the dark. Then, just beyond a thick patch of overgrown vines, they arrived. A small clearing, almost too perfect, too quiet. At the center stood a shrine. Bones hung from its roof like bitter fruit. A small clay pot burned low with fire that didn't flicker. Skulls sat in corners like they were watching. The air was thick, not just with heat, but with something heavier, like the whole space was breathing. A man sat on a mat, made from leopard skin, his back straight, his eyes like still water, quiet but deep enough to drown in. He didn't smile when he saw them. He didn't speak until he had looked Samuel over from head to toe. Then, in a voice as deep as a drum echoing in a cave, he said, "If you speak of this, your tongue will rot, and your mother will die. Do you still want power?" One. Mama Ruth said nothing. She simply turned to Samuel and gave a single nod, eyes unblinking. Samuel's lips didn't move, but his silence was louder than any answer. The man, known only as Elder Nyako, reached into a clay bowl and pulled out a white cloth. Soft, clean, ordinary to the eye. He handed it to Samuel. "This is what you came for," he said. And so, the boy with no congregation, no applause, no name took it. And that night, the stars watched quietly as power changed hands in the forest, cloaked in shadows, bound in silence. One. The morning after that night in the forest, Samuel walked back to the small church with trembling hands and eyes that refused to blink too long. Nikenka looked the same. The rooster crowed as usual. Children kicked stones along the roadside, and smoke from early morning cooking fires curled into the sky. But inside Samuel, a storm had begun. In his shirt pocket sat the white handkerchief Elder Nyako had handed him. It was plain, nothing special to look at, just an old folded cloth with frayed edges. But every time Samuel touched it, something pricked his fingers, like fire too soft to see but too real to ignore. One. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the church floor until dawn, staring at the altar, not praying, not reading scripture, just waiting. For what? He didn't know. But when the sun rose, he stood up, wiped the dust from his trousers, and stepped outside. He didn't go to preach. He didn't call anyone. He simply walked through the market square, holding the cloth in his hand. It was the market woman with the limp who saw him first. She had passed him many times before, usually with a chuckle and a shake of her head. But that morning, when she looked into his eyes, she stopped laughing. Something in his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see everything. Her pain, her fear, even the way she cried at night when her leg ached too much to sleep. One. She didn't speak. She only stepped forward and asked, "Can you pray for me?" Samuel didn't answer with words. He placed the handkerchief gently on her head and whispered something in a language she didn't recognize. Her knees buckled and she collapsed right there in the street. People gathered. Some screamed. Others watched in silence. When she stood up, her limp was gone, completely gone, and so was her fear. She began to shout, "He healed me! He healed me!" over and over. That was all it took. By the time Samuel reached the church, 5 more people were waiting at the door. Within a week, they had filled every seat in the little church, and still, people stood outside, pressing their ears to the open windows. The man they once mocked was now a man of power. They called him Daddy Fire because whenever he lifted the white cloth, it felt like something invisible swept through the room, lighting up bones, cracking open hearts. Women screamed, men wept. Some fainted and had to be carried outside. It was no longer a service, it was a spectacle. And yet, at the very back of the crowd, behind the clapping and hallelujahs, Mama Ruth sat still, her hands folded on her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't lift her voice. She only stared at her son, her eyes clouded with a quiet that knew too much. She had once prayed for him to become great. But now, something in her chest whispered a different prayer, one that had no words, only trembling. One. In just a few months, the little dusty church in Nankenka transformed into something unrecognizable. The leaking roof was replaced with bright zinc sheets. A new sound system crackled with fiery gospel music each morning. Loudspeakers lined the streets, and bold banners with Samuel's face stretched across junctions, his eyes closed, his hands raised, the white handkerchief glowing between his fingers. What once sat quietly at the edge of the village now echoed through every home. People came not just from Nkenka but from faraway towns and cities, traveling for hours, sometimes days, just to witness what they called the fire of God. They brought their sick, their blind, their barren, their broken. They came with jars of anointing oil, photos of loved ones, folded doctors' reports, and desperation painted on their faces. And Samuel, now known as Pastor Fire, met them all with the same soft smile and that burning cloth. The moment he raised it, the atmosphere would shift. People would begin to cry before he even spoke. The healings multiplied. A woman who had been paralyzed for 4 years danced across the altar. A child with no speech began to shout scripture. Money poured in. Testimonies flooded the village. Samuel no longer walked the streets. He was escorted. Bodyguards now flanked him, and assistants carried his Bible. But with all the glory and glitter, there was something else hidden just beneath the surface. Beneath the polished tiled floor of the new church, under the very pulpit where Samuel preached every Sunday, something was buried, something no one saw. It started as a whisper from Elder Nyako. A soft, slow warning. To keep the fire burning, the handkerchief must feed. At first, Samuel had thought it meant fasting or praying, but Nyako shook his head and pointed to the ground. Not your hunger. It's hunger. The first offering was a goat. Samuel buried it under the church one quiet night with shaking hands. But that month, the miracles came slower. The crowds were smaller. The cloth felt colder. The next time, it was a chicken. Still, nothing changed. That's when Nyako said it plainly. Only blood with soul can hold the fire. And Samuel, hungry for more power, terrified of losing everything, did what he never imagined he could do. One rainy night, he found a boy. A small, quiet boy who lived under the bridge near the train station. No one knew his name. No one would ask questions. Samuel lured him with bread, waited until the thunder covered the sound, and did what needed to be done. The next Sunday, the church exploded with power. People didn't just fall, they convulsed. Demons screamed as they left bodies. A man who had been blind since birth opened his eyes and saw his mother for the first time. The handkerchief was burning hot now, so hot Samuel had to hold it with a glove. And the people, they worshipped him. They kissed his shoes. They called him God's chosen. But back in her small compound, Mama Ruth sat beside her window staring at the moon. Her body had grown frail, her voice thin. And though she said nothing aloud, her heart whispered the truth she feared most. Her son had crossed a line, and some doors, once opened, never close again. The days that followed were drenched in praise and glory. Samuel's name was now on every tongue. Newspapers called him the miracle son of Africa. A popular Lagos TV host invited him for a live broadcast. Clips of him waving the handkerchief and casting out demons went viral, drawing crowds even larger than before. With his growing fame came wealth, cars, a mansion in the city, foreign donors, and private jet invitations. But beneath the glory, something had begun to rot. It started with the smell, faint at first, a metallic tang in the air whenever he entered the church. The incense burned heavier to cover it up. Then the nightmares came. Every night, the boy he had buried stood at the foot of his bed, silent, eyes wide. Sometimes, the boy was crying. Other times, he pointed to the altar. Samuel would wake, drenched in sweat, gasping, gripping the handkerchief until his fingers cramped. And yet, in public, he was unshakable, powerful, fearless. He became the vessel of fire they all wanted him to be. No one saw his trembling hands during prayer. No one noticed how his eyes darted nervously at shadows in the corners of the room. But his mother did. Mama Ruth had grown quieter, frailer. Each time she saw Samuel, she noticed it. The way he avoided her gaze, the coldness that now lived behind his warm smile. One afternoon, as she brought a pot of stew to his compound, she paused near the entrance of his prayer room, and she heard it. Not tongues, not worship, but a voice, deep and broken, whispering from beneath the ground. One. She didn't say a word. She just left the food and walked home barefoot. That night, she cried for the first time in years. Meanwhile, back at the church, things began to shift. A woman collapsed during service and never woke up. A man who had claimed to be healed returned 2 weeks later, screaming and foaming at the mouth. When Samuel raised the handkerchief to pray for him, the cloth slipped from his grip, hitting the ground with a thud like soaked linen. The crowd gasped. For the first time, doubt crept into their voices. Samuel forced a smile, quickly regaining control. "The Lord is testing our faith," he declared, but the fire in his voice had dimmed. And somewhere in the crowd, Mama Ebele, one of the church's first converts, turned to her daughter and whispered, "Something is wrong. That fire, it burns strange now." Even Nyako noticed. He approached Samuel after service with a calm face but tense voice. "The handkerchief is hungry again," he said simply. "The last boy's blood is fading." Samuel clenched his fists. "I gave everything," he hissed. But Nyako only nodded and said, "Then you know what must come next." And just like that, Samuel realized the terrifying truth. Once you feed the fire, you belong to it. And when it calls, you obey, or it devours you instead. She was barely 15, a quiet girl from the edge of town named Adaora. She had joined the church just months ago with her aunt, who'd brought her to receive deliverance from recurring dreams. At first, she was shy, barely speaking, always sitting near the back. But something about her presence made others uneasy. Some said her eyes lingered too long. Others whispered that she saw things. Pastor Samuel ignored the murmurs. He had more pressing matters to attend to. The crowds were thinning, the miracles less frequent. Even the handkerchief had grown heavy in his palm, like a burden instead of a blessing. But Adaora saw what others didn't. She watched, she listened, and one evening, after a revival program had ended and the crowd dispersed, she remained behind. Hidden in the shadows behind the choir loft, she watched as Nyako approached the altar, lifted the rug, and unlocked a small trapdoor hidden beneath the pulpit. She saw the flicker of red candles below, the stained earth, the strange carvings on the wall, and she saw Samuel descend into it, his white robe brushing the edges of the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but something inside her whispered, "Watch, child. Watch and remember." She waited until they had left. Then she walked home silently, heart pounding with every step. That night, with trembling hands, Adaora opened her phone and recorded a voice note. Her voice was soft, hesitant at first, but clear. "My name is Adaora. I go to the church where they say Pastor Samuel heals people. But I saw something tonight, something under the altar. There's a door. There's blood. I think he's doing something dark. Please, if anything happens to me, don't let this go unheard." She sent the voice note to one person, her cousin in Lagos, a university student active on social media. He posted the audio without editing, just her voice against a black screen. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By morning, it had been downloaded, reshared, and quoted by thousands. "Young girl exposes pastor's dark secret" was trending on every platform. Samuel's photo, once plastered with words like anointed and chosen, was now being edited with captions like false prophet and child blood rituals. By Sunday, the church was surrounded, not by worshippers, but by angry villagers, journalists, even policemen. Some came with phones, others came with cutlasses. Mama Ruth stood by the window of her home, eyes swollen with tears, murmuring verses under her breath. Her son had built an empire on ashes, and now the wind was beginning to blow. Inside the church, Samuel knelt in his prayer room, gripping the handkerchief that now felt ice cold. He whispered, "Lord, speak to me. Tell me what to do." But for the first time since it all began, the fire did not answer, only silence. The sun had barely risen when the police arrived with a warrant, accompanied by local elders, a few pressmen, and a growing crowd of villagers that buzzed with restless energy. The heavy oak doors of the church were broken open without ceremony. Samuel stood inside, alone, hands raised as if in surrender, but his eyes were distant, hollow. His once gleaming robe was wrinkled, his collar stained with sweat. For the first time, the boy who once called down fire looked like he had been consumed by it. Nyako was nowhere to be found. The officers fanned out across the building, but it was the trapdoor beneath the altar they were drawn to, just as Adaora had described. Two officers lifted the rug and stared at the small iron ring buried in the floor. One knelt and pulled it open. A wave of stench burst upward, followed by a chilling cold that didn't belong in the land of the living. Torchlights flickered. A narrow wooden stairway led into a stone-lined room beneath the church, and what they found there silenced even the boldest of them. On the walls, symbols had been carved, hundreds of them, etched with what looked like dried blood. In the center was a slab of stone, darkened and worn. Chains were still bolted to the ground. Beside the altar, decayed bones lay partially buried, wrapped in the remnants of children's clothing, dolls, shoes, rusted tin plates, tattered Bibles, offerings from broken innocence. The silence in the room was suffocating. One officer covered his mouth. Another cursed under his breath. A cameraman lowered his device and stepped back. Everyone knew now. This wasn't just rumor. This was something ancient, evil, deliberate. Mama Ebele, who had once danced in the front row, fainted on the spot when she was shown the photos. Young men from the community threatened to burn the church down that very night. But the elders insisted, let the truth be seen first. Outside, Samuel was handcuffed without resistance. As they led him away, he didn't scream or struggle. He simply muttered to himself, I just wanted the fire. I just wanted to be used. That evening, Adaora was taken into protective custody. Her voice note had shattered an illusion that had held hundreds in spiritual captivity. Mama Ruth was escorted to her home. She said nothing. But when she entered, she walked to Samuel's childhood room, took down the framed portrait of his baptism, and wept like a woman who had lost her son long before that morning. The village buzzed for days. Parents pulled their children from churches. Crowds debated whether Samuel had been evil from the start or if something had changed him. But those who were closest to the truth, those who had felt the strange air, the trembling in their chests during service, they knew. The boy who had once danced in the street for coins had become something else. Not by accident, but by choice. Weeks passed, and the ruins of what had once been the most powerful church in the region stood empty, its doors sealed, its name scraped off the signboard by angry hands. The wind carried whispers through the broken windows, as though the building itself was trying to mourn. No one dared enter, not even the beggars who used to sit at its gate. What was once called the House of Fire had become a place people crossed the road to avoid. Samuel sat in a cold grey cell, no longer the man who had once been praised as Daddy Fire. His robe had been replaced with a faded prison uniform, and the only audience he had now were the distant footsteps of guards and the occasional lawyer who barely looked him in the eye. He refused visitors, even Mama Ruth. When asked why he had done it, he often stared into space and said, "The miracles were real. I just needed help making them happen." But even those words felt like lies trying to mask something deeper, something broken. Nyako was never found. Some said he fled the country. Others whispered he vanished into the forest, carried away by the very spirits he once served. A few swore they saw him in another town, preaching again under a new name, but no one could confirm it, and no one wanted to look too closely. As for Adaora, her life changed overnight. From a quiet girl no one noticed to a name on every news outlet, she found herself both praised and pitied. But Adaora didn't want attention. She had seen too much, too young. With the help of a women's group, she was enrolled in school far from the village. Her only request? Don't let anyone know where I am. I just want peace. Mama Ruth returned to her garden, her back bent with age and grief. Every now and then, neighbors would hear her singing hymns softly under her breath, watering the soil her son once played in. I raised him to love the Lord, she would whisper to herself. But I forgot to teach him how to survive power. The villagers rebuilt in their own way. A new pastor came to town, But this time, the congregation was wary. They asked more questions. They watched more closely. And whenever someone shouted too loudly or claimed to have the fire, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The legend of Pastor Samuel didn't fade easily. Some still argued he had done good, that he had healed the sick, helped the poor, given hope. But others remembered the basement, the bones, the handkerchief that dripped in silence. And in that clash of memory and disbelief, a new kind of faith was born, one not built on noise or crowds, but on quiet, steady truth. In the end, the fire did fall, but it didn't bring revival. It brought judgment. And for those who had followed blindly, it left behind only ash and a lesson carved deep into the soul of a village that would never forget. Months later, the church building still stood, hollow and quiet, though nature had begun reclaiming it. Vines crept up its stone walls, birds nested in the eaves, and rain slipped through the cracks in the roof, washing the dust into the cracked tiled floor. But the pulpit remained, the very one where Samuel once stood, eyes closed, hands lifted, claiming fire from heaven. The same pulpit that now held no voice, only silence. A few brave souls returned one day, not to worship, but to confront what was left. They came not with banners or songs, but with candles, letters, flowers, and broken hearts. Parents knelt at the altar where they once danced in gratitude, now weeping for children who had vanished without answers. A young man stood where he once served as an usher, whispering, "We were all blind, all of us." His voice trembled. "We saw what we wanted to see." One of them found the courage to remove what was left of the ornate pulpit cover. Beneath it was a small metal plaque, likely forgotten by those who built the church. "Let all who speak here tremble before the truth." Irony hung thick in the air. Meanwhile, a small gathering began forming at the edge of the village. Not a church, not a revival, but a quiet circle of those who had been wounded, widows, former members. A woman who had offered her only savings to Samuel and never received the healing she was promised. A boy who still woke up crying from the sound of screams beneath the altar. They met under a tree, no microphones, no robes, just raw honesty. Some called it a support group, others called it healing. Among them, Adaora's name was often spoken, not as a victim, but as a voice of courage. Though she was now far away, her message had left an imprint. A schoolgirl with no title, no stage, no fire, had broken through what no elder dared to challenge. Not because she had power, but because she told the truth. Pure, painful truth. And somewhere in that quiet village, Mama Ruth began visiting the homes of those Samuel once hurt. No longer the proud mother of Daddy Fire, she came not with explanations but with apologies. "He was my son," she would say, "but you were my children too." Her words didn't heal everything, but they softened what had been hardened by betrayal. The scars remained, on hearts, in homes, beneath floorboards. But slowly, something else took root. Not revival, not religion, but wisdom. The kind that grows after fire, burns everything fake to the ground. The kind that questions miracles and honors truth. The kind that knows that not all who cry, "Lord, Lord," are speaking to the heavens. And as the pulpit stood empty, cracked but not collapsed, a new kind of faith began rising. Not loud, not showy, but grounded, cautious, and more real than anything the village had known before. Far from the village, in a quiet boarding school tucked between soft hills and rustling trees, Adaora sat by the window of her dorm room, writing in her journal. Her handwriting was neat, careful, each word chosen like a thread in a woven cloth. The other girls giggled around her, talking about exams, hairstyles, and weekend meals. But Adaora lived in a different world now, not because of what she had done, but because of what she had survived. She didn't speak much about the church. When teachers asked about her past, she simply said, "I used to sing a lot." And if anyone pressed further, she would smile gently, then change the subject. The past clung to her like a shadow, not heavy enough to break her, but never fully gone. One day, a letter arrived for her, no return address, only her name written in thick, trembling handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. "You were braver than all of us. I see clearly now. Thank you. It was unsigned, but she didn't need a name to know who it was from. Somehow, even after all that had happened, Mama Ruth had found a way to speak, not in defense of her son, but in honor of the truth that saved others from him. Adaora folded the letter and tucked it between the pages of her journal. Then she looked outside, watching the sun drop low across the trees, casting gold across the hills. There was peace in her face, not because she had forgotten, but because she had found purpose. Back in the village, the ruins of the church had become a quiet reminder. Some wanted to tear it down, others said to leave it, let it stand as a warning, but most simply passed by in silence. Where once there had been shouting and performance, there was now reflection. People prayed in their homes, visited the sick quietly, and gave without cameras or applause. It wasn't perfection, but it was something closer to real. They say one match can burn down an empire, but Adaora hadn't meant to light a fire. All she did was speak when it mattered. In a world where everyone had bowed, she stood. Where everyone had followed, she paused. And because of that, what was built on fear, secrets, and manipulation came crashing down. She was just a girl with a song in her throat and courage in her spine. But in the end, that was enough. Thank you for following this story. If it moved you, if it opened your eyes or made you think twice about the world we trust too easily, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment below. What would you have done in Adaora's place? Let's keep telling stories that matter. Let's keep truth louder than noise. See you in the next one.